Yes. So Stu is my cameraman tonight. Welcome to the back room at Tim J. Leary Studios in Palm Springs. I'm looking forward to another night. This is the third in a series of art talks that I'm giving, where I'm giving myself the opportunity to talk about my views of art and how I perceive it as I go. I will start with my regular libation, which is this here, just a little bit. Okay, so cheers, have something yourself. So my topic tonight is going to be about something that I mentioned at the end of the last two talks. I realized the other day I had made a passing comment about Basquiat's art that I'm intrigued by it, but then I dropped it. And I realized that whenever a student of mine would do something like that, especially if they did it more than once, I would ask them to tell me more. So that's what I want to do. Basquiat's art, and I'll show pictures of that in a couple of minutes, looks primitive and some possibly juvenile and graffiti-like. He's from that era. And that's not my style of art, but there's something about that is inspiring me. And it has to do with the looseness of the work. And so the question is, why is that beautiful? Because we have some very specific ideas of what is beautiful. So, voila, I have some books, and I'm going to refer to these as I go. I'm going to start with a short quote from this book, one of my favorites. John O'Donoghue was an Irish philosopher, just died a few years ago, from the west of Ireland, and actually lived in the area of Ireland that I visited in 2012. He wrote this book about beauty. He's a philosopher and was a spiritual man, a religious man. But here's where he starts. Beauty emerged early in human reflection and has been the inspiration and passion at the heart of human creativity ever since. Some of the most profound reflection on beauty was developed during medieval times. The secret dream of thought is to unfold everything with the contour of the idea. This is the eros of thought, to desire everything. It wants to leave nothing out. Thought is curious and is driven by the desire to know. It wants to draw aside the veils of illusion and see what reality conceals. Words, images, and ideas are its instruments of illumination. So ideas. And so that's kind of where I'm at. That whole thing of desiring actually comes out for me when I see a piece of work that really inspires me. So let's start by looking at Basquiat, a little bit of Basquiat. So he, a bit of a tragic figure and died of a drug overdose. But this work, which when I was doing art therapy, would be very provocative and something that you could talk about, is not the typical kind of thing you see in places like museums, yet his work is in museums and is quite valuable. So what is it that's different about this work than our traditional ideas of beauty? And why is it intriguing? And what draws us in, or draws me in anyway, I'll say that. Let me come back to him, because I wanted to say, John O'Donoghue says medieval times there were interesting thoughts about beauty, and we have some pretty definite ideas of what's beautiful. So this painting, we all agree is a beautiful painting, but why is this beautiful? So a Renaissance painting after the medieval times, and by Leonardo da Vinci. And he employs some specific geometry to this. Geometry that is drawn from the Pythagorean theory, Pythagoras of Greek fame, and the golden mean. And the idea that there is a proportion that is inherently beautiful or inherently divine. So I have a recollection of when I taught color and design theory, someone giving me a PowerPoint display about this, the Fibonacci sequence and the golden mean. And it was something that was originally created for cosmetology students, so it focused on the face. And it's about the proportions. So there is a proportion, it's approximately 1/3, 2/3. And if you watch TV, the next time you're watching TV and someone is interviewed, not on the news, to show where they're interviewing someone, typically they are not in the center of the screen. This is the reason why we find it attractive. So the face in the PowerPoint of the gorgeous proportion turned out to be an early picture of George Clooney. If you think about it, everybody, I've always thought George Clooney was incredibly handsome. Now I have a good reason why. So there's more of this. So this also is another example of what we think is beautiful. Now, some of the things that are beautiful about this have to do with the technique and the light and shading, the shadowing that was done. This is the Sistine Chapel, so it's Michelangelo's work. Quite beautiful. And beautiful, here's the Last Judgment. And is that better? Okay. Here's the Last Judgment. And it really is beautiful, but if you notice, there is some symmetry and there is some intentional geometry that he puts into place. So not long after that, so Da Vinci and Michelangelo, who knew each other and I understand didn't actually like each other, in competition with one another in Rome, had slightly different approaches, but they used those things. So I've got another, I showed a little Rembrandt last time, and I have another Rembrandt, and I wanted to show some things. I'm not sure how well you can see this one here, but there is a formal, there's a triangle. If you bring up to here and go down, there's actually two pyramids that create this composition. And it's an order. There's an orderly force brought into a drawing like this. The other thing I find interesting about these Rembrandt pieces is that some of the sketching is very loose. Let me find another example of that. Well, I guess this one here, it's not as organized, it's not as tight, it's loose, it's still interesting. Maybe it's interesting just because it's Rembrandt and we know he was famous. And he lived in a beautiful place where he drew beautiful things. Some lovely portraits, but here this one on this side, I think, has some loose, he's suggesting things. So he's giving us a focus to, we definitely see the man in the chair, but the other things are given less importance in there. Okay. So back to Basquiat. Here's some more of his work. I think this one, what is it about this one? So I'm not sure what, because I think that this is fascinating, and I don't ever find this kind of work coming out of my pencil or my pen. When it does, I usually dismiss it. And I think that might have something to do with why it's intriguing, because I think when it does, it might be interesting. But I have an idea that needs to be more like the other examples. I happen to like this blue piece of Basquiat as well. A little more organized, not as chaotic, still very graffiti-like. So there's a whole thing. I had a lot of students who really loved graffiti, and graffiti can be really cool. Really cool. And the other famous graffiti artist is Keith Haring, who we know. So at the Broad in LA, Keith Haring and Basquiat are displayed together in the same room, with Haring on one wall, Basquiat on another, side by side, and it's obviously intentional. Keith Haring, famous for going down into the New York subways in the 80s and on blank billboards, painting and doing graffiti. He was arrested for this a few times. They probably stopped arresting him after his paintings showed up in MoMA in New York. But he then, of course, became famous for his work with AIDS awareness and the work that he did around those topics. But his works are always very simple, very straightforward. There's not a lot of color, if any. Some of them are just a single color like this. And the compositions are really, really basic, really simple, and really straightforward. And there's a bunch of them in here, and each one has its own idea, its own meaning. And then I have another thing here that I want to show, which is the Frida Kahlo, the Diary of Frida Kahlo. I got this a few years ago. I was going to do an MFA program in San Francisco, which I backed out of at the last minute, but I bought the textbook ahead of time. And so here this is photographs of, and there's text later on, photographs of the Diary of Frida Kahlo. And again, I think this one's really interesting. There's a lot going on in here, a lot of layers added on. Almost muddies it, but it's still, the image is still strong enough to be recognized. And here too, a face on a face. There we go. So these were probably her early ideas, probably things that she would develop later. Not very different from the final works, but you can see that. I have something else saved here because I think that's a really interesting idea. So, and this one too on the side. I like the way she has contained it inside that shape. And it's got a lot of feeling. So I wonder then if